Dominique Johnson was elected to the state legislature in 2022 to serve the residents of Norwalk and Westport in the 143rd District. She currently serves as Deputy Majority Caucus Chair and Assistant Majority Leader. She is also on the Higher Education and Employment Advancement and Judiciary committees. Before joining the legislature, Representative Johnson served as an at-large member of Norwalk's Common Council and chair of its Community Services Committee. So welcome to 06880, the podcast.
Dan, it's wonderful to be here. Thank
you. I tried to get you for a while.
I know you did, and we just never, our schedules could never.
You work too hard.
Well, I could say the same about you. So now we're here, and it's amazing. Thank you for the invitation.
Here we are. So how does a person become a state representative? Is this something as a kid you yearned to do, or what happened?
No, that's a good question, because my answer is, I don't know if it's still unique, but I do serve with people that, like myself, this was never an intention. Being a politician or running for office specifically, I didn't think about it. Some people, that is, a dream from when they're a kid. But
kids with the pencils behind their ears?
I don't know. I might have had a pencil behind but that was for a different purpose. I was a violinist. So yeah, no. See, I was going to do something very different with my life. But then fast forward, I was very involved, especially in the 2008 presidential race. Was the first time I got involved in politics. Like, I had been involved in activism and advocacy in my community, but that was the first time I got involved in politics. And
was it because of Barack Obama?
It was. I volunteered. This is the pencil part, very nerdy. I was a data fellow for his campaign. And so at the time I was finishing up my dissertation, and I had like 4 or 5 months where I just had the opportunity to work full time. So luckily I could. And that I think really changed not only my relationship with politics, but my viewpoint on how you could be involved to work on solutions in that way. So fast forward, to 8 years later, in the 2016 election, I wasn't able because of work and life to be as involved. But then I thought, well, let me get involved locally and join my local Democratic Party. And then it really fast-tracked from there very quickly. So at some point, I was very involved in encouraging other women to run. And at some point, when the question comes back to you about why don't you run, eventually you answer yes, when you're asked enough, So
did you do the leadership program at Yale?
I did.
Women's leadership program?
I did. I did that 2 years ago this summer. I was in that class, and that was a wonderful experience that really, it dovetailed incredibly well with the campaign that I had just announced for the state rep seat, since our now Secretary of State indicated she was moving up there, and this seat became an open seat. So it was a wonderful experience, and I owe a lot to, Patty Russo has a curriculum unlike any other.
And it's nonpartisan, right?
Nonpartisan. Folks from all parties and all over the country come. The people that teach you consult for people of all sorts of backgrounds from different parties as well. And if I hadn't had that experience on Barack Obama's campaign and subsequent experiences in the 2020 election, volunteering there in key races and during the late help part where they got the band back together from the Obama years to help with the Biden 2020. But if I hadn't had that, it would have opened up my eyes to just what it takes to do this. But it was a very excellent reminder of what it takes to do this.
What does it take?
The grit, the just going further than you think you can. It's a marathon. The advice is like, when you think you've knocked enough doors, you have to knock more. And it's all about relationships, of course, but getting out and talking to people where they are. So thus, like, knocking doors and being with people in the community. And
your district is really two communities. It's Norwalk, and it's part of Norwalk and part of Westport.
Yes.
Two fairly different communities.
True. the part of Norwalk, though, I mean, it's a great district. Before, it had a little bit of Wilton in it, and there were different parts of Norwalk in it, and it actually gained more of Westport, particularly Old Hill. So when I went, door to door 2 years ago and subsequently last summer, people were still saying, "Oh, you're my rep now, not Jonathan Steinberg." So there is that part of the district that's new in Westport. And I love it because while we are different communities, the part of Norwalk where I live that is in this district, when you go door to door, I think people generally want the same things. Like, we're very focused on the education of our children. We're very focused on quality of life. We're focused on making sure we keep investing in our community. And I think that there's more in common than not between these neighborhoods in Norwalk and Westport.
Did you have to learn about Westport?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been coming to Westport ever since we moved to Connecticut because we live really close. I live up by Earth Place. So we would always use Main Street and Westport and the beaches as kind of where we would go on weekends in addition to the wonderful opportunities in Norwalk. So lucky for me, that meant that I wasn't starting from scratch. I had, understood how wonderful of a community Westport is. But there was a lot to know about what it's like to live in Westport that people only tell you when you start asking, right? Yeah. And like the little things that you only really can understand if you're living in a community. So I've been really relying on people for that.
For example?
Well, I think, fundamentally, you mentioned differences. We have a very different reality when it comes to funding our public schools. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that people hope for their kids to have here. We have different, obviously, funding realities municipally, but the things that matter to people in Westport that were new to me were the degree to which I think there's like the new and old Westport the way that there's the new and old Norwalk. So I think getting a sense of what the priorities are for people in Westport, where there's, I think, a desire among a lot of people here to hold on to like the Westport Country Playhouse and the things that historically have made Westport internationally known, where there are newer folks who've moved in, just like in Norwalk, especially my neighborhood.
Well, your neighborhood had the White Barn Theater.
It did, and I am still upset that we couldn't save it. I know Norwalk Land Trust tried.
Yeah.
But that was like the last piece of open space in Norwalk.
Now
but it's
15 houses there?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't driven through, but I drive by all the time. But that's a really good example is like, how do we keep that? What makes us great? While at the same time, my zip code in Norwalk is one of the fastest growing apparently in the country.
Wow.
I think. There was an article about that in the Hour not too long ago. So I think there is that, we're all in flux in communities all across the nation, but that's one of the ways. So how do we maintain these things that are traditions, like the Newmans, at the same time we welcome in all the things that make Westport an evolving great community.
So do you hear from constituents?
I do. And it varies. Like a lot of times they're the form letters. So I always take stock of kind of how many of each I get in terms of for or against a particular bill or provision. Westporters care deeply about the environment. They care deeply about maintaining, I think, the parks and the space and the river and the beautiful beaches. So that's something that really resonated with me. And that's something that I think, back to your earlier question, that I learned just how deep that goes, especially the communities around Nash's Pond, right? It depends like what neighborhood you're in, but there's a lot of like very specific focus on the environment. As well as making sure that kids have opportunities in schools, that we give a little, that we kind of move toward things like play-based learning, or we move towards making sure that we have opportunities for young people to have like gap year opportunities, right? So I think that's part of what I learned going door to door too.
So you are on the education committee.
I am, yeah.
What are the issues that you deal with there?
That's a very interesting question because we have issues that are in many ways affecting very specific districts and then also issues that affect the entire state. And sometimes they're not the same thing. And so, or you get something that is, passion project of a certain member of the Senate or the House, and it finally makes its way through. We mandate a lot of things across the state, and that's also something I've heard from, folks specifically on our Board of Education. But, how do we deal with these mandates in a way where it's not just constantly layering them on?
Yeah, there's always new mandates. You never take any away.
Right. So there was a bill this past year that we just passed that was mandate relief. So I'm really glad that that went through. But we also did add more mandates.
That's a new mandate.
And from being in education yourself, sometimes they're coming in, many of these with the best intentions, but when you have 169 different ways of educating the kids all across the state, it can take very different forms. And so I understand now more than ever why certain opt-out provisions are important so that they can be tailored to the district. We did have another example is it was a lot of things are coming from teachers too, because we're trying to retain teachers and make their quality of life on the job as best as possibly can, especially right now, coming out of COVID and all the things that, that they had to deal with. So, sometimes this takes the form of allowing them to use more play-based learning. Sometimes it takes the form of they needed the kindergarten start age to change, but that also had after effects for childcare. And I heard it from a lot of constituents, both in Norwalk and Westport, about that. So I'm really glad that in many ways, my communities, that's a good example of like Norwalk and Westport both decided, all right, we're going to use the opt-out to create a thing that works for us. It's not that they don't want kids to be developmentally on target. It's just, it looks different for us. Yeah.
This is also a state that has spectacularly unequal resources in education.
And that comes up, I think, in lots of legislation is how do we rectify that in a way that's sustainable? And I don't know, we clearly haven't gotten there yet. I know the ECS funding is supposed to be a mechanism for that. And it's trying, we sped that up last year, which is going to help with a lot of the cliffs post-COVID with the federal funding. But by no means we're not out of the woods for sure. And that to me speaks to the fact that we do have the biggest opportunity gaps, I think, still out of any state. The data hasn't changed.
It would not surprise me.
Okay. I don't think it has. But, and that's one of the reasons, frankly, I wanted to be on that committee was I can bring kind of what I knew of as an education policy researcher to bear on this. Like, really, it's like almost a wicked problem that we still are facing. And you can kind of point to a few different things, but it's so nuanced. It's not like one thing that's going to change this. But if we keep, a lot of this is just trying to work around the edges, but there's a core problem I think really at some point we're going to have to try to address. That's why I focus on early childhood literacy so much. It's a passion for me, but it's also the one thing, based on my expertise and background, I felt we could bolster more as a possible solution to this problem.
Everything follows from early childhood.
Yes. Yeah.
And what I'm hearing from you, I think, is that these solutions, you can't have them while whittling away at what makes an education system like Westport strong, right? That you've got to bring everybody up rather than mandate, take this away from a district like Westport.
I think
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Right. There is how I would rephrase that is we sometimes I see why we need mandates because children are not reading on grade level in many districts. In enough, there's enough of a concern that other districts need more help, right? I think from the state to kind of guide them as to here are some best practices. This has gotten, the discrepancies are intense enough that we need you to really focus in on this. So sometimes I see it as, if you think of it in a positive light, it's more of a nudge from the state to say, you really need to focus on this more. And then in the case, I understand, though, in the land of steady habits, why we have opt-outs. Because then there are districts who are doing things like Norwalk leads on a lot of things, even though we're a district that really does need, our numbers for literacy and numeracy could be much better. But that also falls along lines. We have a lot of socioeconomic diversity in Norwalk, as you know. And so, these disproportionalities are based on race and class in many ways, as we know the data would bear that out. So I think the question to me can't just be like regionalization. That's not the answer. But I think that we are all, like you said, we're all rising together.
Yeah.
But some people may not see it that way. But I think that, we are a state, and we do have to care about those among us who aren't necessarily ready for college or the next step, whatever that is, and how that affects us all. I mean, the Dalio Foundation, we passed a bill about, disconnected youth. And there are in every town, even in Westport, right? Young people who may not have finished high school or finished, but like aren't employed, aren't in higher ed. And that is a concern, not only for our workforce, but for our future. And so, I mean, they're trying to lead on that. And I think that that's a good reminder, right? That if we don't, it's one thing even to graduate high school, but if you're disconnected after high school, that's going to be another issue that, we have to, as a society, decide how are we going to help people.
So you've mentioned Hartford quite a bit.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get the impression here that your colleagues in the legislature look at Fairfield County as a piggy bank.
You're not wrong.
Yeah. How do they view you and this area?
What's interesting is case in point with education. So I show up like the first few days of my term, education committee starts meeting, and then I start talking about, and I served all of Norwalk when I was on the council. So while I'm serving a part of Norwalk now, the stories and the experiences of talking with people like stays with me. And I'm talking to some of my colleagues from around the state about Norwalk schools. This is our student population. These are the needs of our students. These are the challenges we're facing. And they're looking at me like, are you really? Wow. And we are Fairfield County. We are the suburbs of New York is the line we hear.
Right.
Right. And then on top of that, because of our ultra wealthy residents down here, there's the impression that there's very little to no poverty in places like Norwalk, that there are people that people in Westport would be houseless or food insecure is not even a thought that crosses anybody's mind, probably. So, I mean, there's that too, right? So when you paint us with a broad brush up in Hartford, it does a disservice to our actual lived experiences down here. But I think that is something I think I constantly have to push against, right? That we're just, we are, the stereotype.
We are not the Gold Coast.
Well, we are, but it's more nuanced than that, right? Yeah, that's kind of my impression of it.
Right.
Yeah.
The impression that I get of Hartford also is that there's more bipartisanship than there is in, say, the U.S. Congress.
Oh, yes.
Is that true?
Yes. I mean, I know Rep. Jim Himes talks about that a lot, but I can say I can't imagine that the U.S. Congress does what we do, which is that like 90-some percent, I'll say 90-some percent, I don't know the exact, of our bills that we pass are bipartisan. Very rarely do we have bills that are straight up partisan. Like the climate bill in the House 5004 was an example of that. But there are always examples, and that's great. That's good. Like, we're not always going to agree. And sometimes we just, need to vote to move something that is important to a majority of people in the state and then represent our districts accordingly. Whether you're yes or no, I think you vote your conscience and or your constituents. I've been lucky that I haven't had an issue where those two things diverge. Mm-hmm. Though I'm not naive enough to think that may not happen. but I think there is that part of this where I can't fathom the U.S. Congress doing what we do and passing 90% of bills that are generally bipartisan. And I can speak now as the work I've done in the caucus, the bill 5001, which I was incredibly proud to work on that team. I'm not on the aging committee, but that committee is a model for how we should run, how we should legislate, how we should run our committees, how we should work together. Bill? It was the huge elder care bill we just passed, was the priority of the caucus this past session. It has been called sweeping, and I see why. I mean, we've done things to bring Connecticut up among the best in the nation for how we care for our elders, with home care in particular. The governor had a nursing home bill that also passed. But this elder care bill, one of the provisions I'm most proud of that I not being on the committee and being new, I was kind of the person that's like, hey, we thought of that. Have we thought about presumptive eligibility? I know you've been working on it for a while, but is this the vehicle? And it was, and we passed it. So now we're going to have a pilot to make sure that it's going to return. It's supposed to save us millions. And so we have 2 years to see if that is in fact the case. But that's a great example of, man, if we could run our government the way the Aging Committee in Hartford runs, I think, it would probably be too centrist for a lot of people who are on the real extremes, but you never know, because it's like fundamentally it's about making sure people are taken care of. So it's a different way of thinking about it, I think.
So what have you learned in Hartford? What surprises, preconceptions that you had that have been shattered?
Yeah, what's interesting is I tried to go with an open mind. I'm somebody who's still, I do have this, I try to do this differently because of not only what I did before and what I'm trying to do up there for our communities. The one thing I can tell you is that, and I just will be transparent, that's how I am. This is how I feel, that a lot of things about government at the state level, because that's all I can speak to at this point, turned out to be, how do I say this? Things I didn't want to be true are true. But it is what it is. And then how do we operate within that?
Can you give me an example?
Well, there's a lot of personalities. A lot of this, being on a council, you like the RTM here, you see how much of this is personalities, right? And that's not necessarily bad, but sometimes it becomes less about policy than it should in my mind. But I come from a world where policy is really important, and trying to create good policy is very important. And so like making that grounded in communities as opposed to certain interests of certain people is always like the challenge, I think. You have a lot of amazing advocates that go to the building that advocate on behalf of the Alzheimer's Association or any number of issues, right? But then you also have, politics, and then what that does to the process, right? At the end of the day, it can sometimes leave you feeling, there's some disappointment in it,
Sure.
where you get really close and then it just all falls apart. So that's the part that's a little discouraging. But I wasn't naive enough to think that wouldn't happen. But it's just, and then sometimes things become more about personality than you would think,
Sure.
But I think if you can work with people and you can build relationships, that's always a plus. So that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to be that partner to Rep. Steinberg. And in the House for Westport, I've tried to be, a voice for the things I know that are important to my neighbors, because, I hear from them enough that it gives me a good sense, and I reach out, and that's important. The other part of it is that whenever I pull off the Merritt and I'm driving home, I feel like I'm home.
Wow.
So that's good. Because the place, like anything, it's an honor to be up there. It's awe-inspiring to go into this beautiful building.
It's a gorgeous building.
It's incredible. And then you've got, pictures of portraits of Abraham Lincoln and like parts of the Charter Oak and like all these amazing, the statue of Nathan Hale. It's incredible that I get to be there and sit at this desk because people have entrusted me. And that's incredible. But then doing the work, a lot of times when I'm home, I'm like, oh, I'm home.
Wow.
It's like I like to spend time at home in our communities. Like
Sure.
That's my favorite part, honestly.
So this is 06880. So
Yeah.
where in 06880 do you hang out?
Well, in 06880, all my spots are, I have to say, like anytime a new vegan restaurant opens, I love it. I like trying all the new spots.
Do you have a go-to?
Well, I feel bad naming things.
Come on.
All right. Well, Green and Tonic is amazing, first of
Okay.
all.
Right around the
yeah.
corner from the library?
And then when a new restaurant opens as a vegan, I'm on the menu, like the Blonde in It, or I know Greenology, or any of that. Like I'm there. I try it.
The Blonde in It is the new Israeli
Yes.
restaurant on
Falafel's super good.
Yep.
Yeah, and then and Greenology just opened next to Pizza Life. Pizza Life has an amazing vegan mozzarella pizza. If
Okay.
anybody's into that. I feel like we used to go a lot to, we used to go to Oscars and then Rye Ridge, and we go, Golds sometimes
Mm-hmm.
for Knish. You got to have the Knish. And then, all my spots. But yeah, it's just between the grocery shopping that you got to do, like from Trader Joe's here and there, But then the beach, like, oh man, Sherwood Island has always been. We were coming to Sherwood Island when we were visiting friends in New Haven before we even moved here. I love the Playhouse. I don't get there as often as I like. But yeah, walking the dog in the winter at Campo. These were things we all did before I even got active in local politics.
Sure.
So I could keep going. I mean, the library is amazing too, obviously.
Quite a place.
But yeah, and everything that, the community, I mean, also Westport MoCA is now MoCA of Connecticut, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, but that
MoCA CT.
MoCA CT. So that's been a wonderful thing, and that's in my district too. So that's a wonderful place to visit at least once or twice a year. Yeah.
And people don't realize that it's in Norwalk.
Yeah, I know, right?
The entrance is Westport, but the building is Norwalk.
In Norwalk, right? And it's hidden back there, and that's one of the beautiful things about it. It's like you're in, the forest of cranberry, but you're what a gift! Like, it's such a great place.
Do you know what it used to be?
Was it Martha Stewart's?
Before Martha Stewart's TV studio.
I didn't know. Okay, what was it?
It was a ball bearing factory.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a cool part of history. I didn't realize. I knew back to Martha Stewart, but I did not know that. That's great.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I have other things I could list. I'm sure I'm going to forget something, and then I'm going to feel very bad about forgetting it. But yeah.
No, you're a Westporter. You're a Westporter.
I am honored to be a Westporter by what's the word? Adopted?
Not honorary.
Adopted Westporter?
Yeah.
All right, I'll take that because that's an honor.
You're a Westporter.
All right.
Last question. What's
Sure.
ahead?
What's ahead? Oh, I mean, that is, I think what's interesting is we're in this moment in time in our country where, like we've got 5 months to this election. I'm up on the ballot every 2 years. This happens to be it. So what's next for me is, in many ways, talking, about what I've been able to accomplish over 2 years to earn the privilege to go back for another 2. Now, what that means is I also am running on not just what I've done, but what I hope to do. And I want to make sure that connects with and syncs up with what my neighbors want me to work on. I imagine, from what I've been hearing, that means still working on access to childcare for our families. One of the big focus for me the past 2 years is working on policy that helps us with like the so-called SHE session, the disproportionate effect of the COVID pandemic on women and their ability to get back into the workforce. So many stopped out. And the numbers are looking better, but I think there's always more we can do. Mm-hmm. And so that obviously ties in with childcare. Early childhood literacy is something that I'm definitely going to keep working on. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from people that that's something they want me to keep working on, to many of the reasons we discussed earlier, but also because I think there's always going to be a way, if there's a way we can lift up families and bring them together, this is such a great way to do it. So improving on the funding that I was able to get my first term to establish the Early Literacy Fund, building that out even more, making sure we have all the people at the table across the state government and the nonprofit partners to really build this, because it's a movement, I think, and building that out further. Then I think, our libraries obviously are a really important part of that. Another thing I want to keep working on is workforce development. I mean, that comes from the work I did as an education researcher when I saw how important those pathways were to higher education. And as an educator, what an education can do. And I think that's something I really want to keep working on. By no means have we filled the jobs that we were talking about needing to be filled 2 years ago. I mean, there's always, so the Green Jobs Corps bill I worked on and championed. That is, there's going to be some continuation there. I don't know if it's specifically in green jobs, but I want to work on this issue in the ways I can.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
A lot ahead.
And then there's always, and who knows, but there's always the issues of civil rights. I mean, one of the reasons I'm up there too, as I understand it even more and more when I talk to especially young people across the state, as one of the few LGBTQ plus legislators, I talked to a lot of young people across the state, and there is concern of kind of what does this mean for me growing up in this climate. And in Connecticut in particular, we're really lucky, but that's something to be vigilant about, right? So that's on the list too.
All right.
Just
A long list.
a little bit.
Representative Dominique Johnson,
Thank
you for coming on the podcast.
It's so great to be here, Dan.
Thanks for being part of Westport.
Of course. And I have to, can I say that I knew you before I met you because of one of your, I told you, when we met, that one of your books you wrote was helpful for my dissertation. And so this to me is like a very full circle thing. I'm sitting here talking to Dan Woog, whose book, I knew you from your book like 20 years ago. So that's pretty amazing.
That's great. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks again and best of luck.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.